What happens when America's most beloved daytime television host finds herself trapped in a corner, facing the fight of her career? The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting alone in her Manhattan penthouse, stared at her phone with trembling fingers. The number on the screen belonged to someone she never thought she'd have to beg. Someone she'd spent months publicly dismissing, mocking, and trying to destroy. But now, with an $800 million lawsuit hanging over her head like a guillotine, pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The woman on the other end of that phone call held her entire future in her hands. And for the first time in decades, Whoopi Goldberg was about to discover what it felt like to be powerless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany paneled boardroom on the 42nd floor of the ABC News headquarters felt smaller than usual that gray October morning. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sprawled beneath a blanket of storm clouds, matching the mood inside the emergency meeting that would change everything. Rebecca Martinez, the network's chief legal counsel, sat at the head of the polished conference table, her usually composed demeanor cracked like old paint. Scattered before her lay dozens of legal documents, each one representing another nail in the coffin of what had once been considered untouchable. The View had been a BC's golden goose for over 25 years. From its humble beginnings as Barbara Walters' passion project to its evolution into a cultural battleground where America's most pressing issues were dissected daily, the show had weathered countless storms. Political controversies, host departures, public feuds, and even pandemic shutdowns had failed to sink the daytime juggernaut. But this was different. This threatened not just the show's reputation, but its very existence. Whoopi Goldberg entered the room with her characteristic swagger, her colorful cardigan and designer jeans, a stark contrast to the sea of gray suits surrounding the table. At 68, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had conquered every entertainment medium imaginable. Academy Award winner, Broadway star, talk show host, author, entrepreneur. There seemed to be no mountain she couldn't climb. But today, for the first time in her illustrious career, doubt flickered behind her eyes like a candle in the wind. The lawsuit had started small, almost laughably so. 3 months earlier, during a particularly heated segment about political appointments, Whoopi had made what seemed like an offhand comment about Pam Bondi's qualifications for her new role as Attorney General. It wasn't the first time The View had criticized a political figure, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The comment lasted less than 30 seconds, buried in a 20-minute discussion that most viewers would forget by dinner time. But Pam Bondi hadn't forgotten. Within 48 hours, her legal team had filed a defamation lawsuit that made headlines across the country. The initial claim was for $50 million, a sum that a BC's insurance could handle with some creative accounting and a few sleepless nights. What nobody anticipated was how quickly the situation would spiral out of control. Marcus Chun, ABC's head of programming, sat across from Whoopi, his tablet displaying real-time social media metrics that painted a grim picture. The hashtag Boycott The View had been trending for 6 straight days. Advertisers were pulling out faster than water through a broken dam. Campbell's Soup, Procter & Gamble, and even longtime supporter L'Oreal had suspended their sponsorships pending the lawsuit's resolution. The financial bleeding was so severe that some industry analysts were questioning whether the show could survive even if they won in court. Cheryl Foster, the show's executive producer, had been fielding angry calls from corporate executives since dawn. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from talent agents, advertisers, and rival networks, all circling like vultures, waiting to pick apart the remains of what had once been daytime television's most powerful franchise. The stress had aged her 5 years in the past 5 weeks, her usual bright smile replaced by the hollow stare of someone watching their life's work crumble in real time. The door opened, and Thomas Blackwell, a BC's chief executive officer, strode in with the purposeful gait of a man who had made difficult decisions his entire career. His presence immediately shifted the room's energy. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned toward the man who ultimately held their fates in his hands. Blackwell had built his reputation on being unflappable, but the tension, lines around his eyes suggested even he was feeling the pressure. Rebecca cleared her throat, the sound cutting through the suffocating silence like a knife. She opened the thick manila folder before her, revealing documents that would reshape everyone's understanding of just how precarious their situation had become. The legal brief she held contained information that had been closely guarded for weeks, known only to the highest levels of corporate leadership and their most trusted legal advisors. Pam Bondi's legal team had filed an amended complaint the previous Friday, expanding their original claim from $50 million to $800 million. The new filing alleged not just defamation, but a systematic campaign of character assassination, spanning multiple episodes, social media posts, and off-air comments made by various hosts and producers. They claimed that The View had deliberately targeted Bondi with false and malicious statements designed to damage her reputation and professional standing. The amended lawsuit included previously unreported allegations that sent shockwaves through the room. Bondi's lawyers claimed they had evidence of internal communications, where producers and hosts had discussed strategies for undermining her credibility. They alleged that certain segments had been specifically crafted to portray her in the worst possible light, using selective editing and out-of-context quotes to support predetermined narratives. What made the situation exponentially worse was the timing. Bondi had been confirmed as Attorney General just weeks before filing the suit, giving her unprecedented access to federal resources and legal expertise. Her legal team included some of the most feared litigators in the country, attorneys who had taken down Fortune 500 companies and forced billion-dollar settlements from media conglomerates that had previously considered themselves bulletproof. Whoopi listened to the presentation with growing horror, her famous quick wit seemingly paralyzed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. The woman who had built her career on fearlessly speaking truth to power now found herself on the receiving end of a legal assault that threatened everything she had worked to build. Her production company, her endorsement deals, her upcoming book tour, her planned retirement fund, all of it hung in the balance. Marcus pulled up a financial projection on the conference room's massive display screen. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. If they lost the lawsuit, a BC would be looking at not just the $800 million judgment, but potentially hundreds of millions more in legal fees, lost advertising revenue, and contractual penalties. The show's cancellation would cost the network its most profitable daytime slot and could trigger a domino effect that would devastate their entire morning and afternoon lineup. The insurance situation was particularly troubling. ABC's standard media liability policy covered up to $200 million per incident, but Bondi's lawyers had cleverly structured their complaint to fall outside several key coverage areas. They argued that some of the alleged defamatory statements constituted intentional misconduct rather than mere negligence, which could void significant portions of the insurance protection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Cheryl spoke up for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. She described the behind-the-scenes chaos that had consumed the show's production team. Writers were second-guessing every script, legal reviewers were flagging content that would have sailed through approval just months earlier, and guest bookings had become a nightmare as celebrities and politicians distanced themselves from the controversy. The show's other hosts were struggling with the pressure as well. Joy Behar had privately expressed concerns about her own liability, while Sunny Hostin, herself a trained attorney, had begun carefully distancing herself from any segments that could be construed as legally problematic. The chemistry that had made The View appointment television for millions of viewers was evaporating under the weight of legal scrutiny and personal anxiety. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying the faces around the table with the calculating gaze of someone weighing impossible options. He had shepherded a BC through numerous crises over his tenure, but nothing quite like this. The network's parent company, Disney, was already asking pointed questions about how a daytime talk show had managed to expose the entire corporation to nearly $1 billion in potential liability. The public relations nightmare was equally devastating. Conservative media outlets had seized on the lawsuit as proof of liberal bias in mainstream media, while progressive voices criticized The View for giving Bondi a platform to attack free speech. The show found itself caught in a crossfire with no clear path to victory, hemorrhaging credibility with viewers across the political spectrum. Rebecca outlined their legal options, none of which offered much hope for a clean resolution. They could fight the lawsuit in court, but that would mean months or potentially years of expensive litigation with an uncertain outcome. They could attempt to settle, but Bondi's team had so far shown no interest in negotiating anything less than a full public apology and massive financial penalty. They could try to discredit Bondi's claims through aggressive counter-litigation, but that strategy carried the risk of further inflaming public opinion and extending the media circus indefinitely. What made the situation particularly galling was how strategically brilliant Bondi's legal assault had been. Rather than filing in New York, where a BC would have home field advantage, her lawyers had chosen a jurisdiction in Florida where the political climate was far more favorable to their client. They had timed the filing to coincide with Bondi's confirmation hearings, ensuring maximum media coverage and public sympathy for their case. The amended complaint included demands that went far beyond monetary damages. Bondi was seeking a court order requiring The View to issue daily on-air corrections for 30 consecutive days, essentially turning the show into a platform for rehabilitating her reputation. She wanted a BC to establish an ombudsman position, specifically to monitor future coverage of political figures, giving her effective veto power over content that mentioned her name. Most disturbing of all was a provision that would require individual hosts to personally guarantee their compliance with any settlement terms. This meant that Whoopi Joy and the others could face personal bankruptcy if they violated whatever agreement the court ultimately imposed. It was a level of personal accountability that was almost unprecedented in media litigation, designed to ensure that the hosts would think twice before making any future statements that could be construed as defamatory. Marcus shared intelligence from industry contacts suggesting that other political figures were watching the case closely, viewing it as a potential template for their own legal actions against media companies. If Bondi succeeded in extracting a massive settlement from a BC, it could open the floodgates for a new era of litigation that would fundamentally change how news organizations covered public figures. The meeting stretched on for nearly 3 hours, with lawyers, executives, and producers dissecting every aspect of their impossible situation. Charts and graphs filled the walls, showing declining ratings, advertiser exodus, and public opinion polls that painted an increasingly bleak picture. The View, which had once been considered invincible, now looked like a wounded giant stumbling toward an inevitable fall. As the afternoon sun began to filter through the conference room windows, casting long shadows across the table, Thomas made the decision that would change everything. He authorized Rebecca to reach out to Bondi's legal team through back channels, exploring the possibility of a private settlement that could resolve the matter without admitting wrongdoing. It was a humiliating retreat for a company that had built its reputation on journalistic integrity and fearless commentary. But first, someone would have to break the news to Whoopi that her empire was crumbling. and that saving it might require her to do something she had never done in her entire career: beg for mercy from someone she had publicly humiliated. The woman who had spent decades speaking truth to power was about to discover what it felt like to be powerless herself. The conference room slowly emptied as executives and lawyers scattered to their respective damage control missions. Whoopi remained in her chair long after the others had gone, staring out at the Manhattan skyline with the hollow expression of someone watching their world collapse in slow motion. The city that had made her a star now felt like a prison, and somewhere in Florida, Pam Bondi was holding the key. The phone call that would determine her fate was still hours away, but already Whoopi could feel the weight of words she never thought she would have to say. For the first time in her life, the woman who had built her career on never backing down was preparing to surrender. The only question was whether Pam Bondi would be merciful enough to let her keep whatever dignity remained. The clock on Whoopi's kitchen wall ticked past midnight as she paced her Manhattan penthouse like a caged animal. The weight of the day's revelations pressed down on her shoulders with crushing force. 3 cups of chamomile tea sat untouched on the granite countertop, growing cold as her mind raced through impossible scenarios. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by an endless loop of worst-case outcomes that played behind her eyes like a horror film she couldn't turn off. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly since leaving the ABC offices. Text messages from concerned friends, missed calls from reporters, and email notifications from her various business managers, all demanding answers she didn't have. The outside world sensed blood in the water, and the feeding frenzy had begun in earnest. Entertainment Tonight, TMZ, and a dozen other outlets were already running speculative pieces about the lawsuit's potential impact on her career. But it was the silence from certain quarters that worried her most. Her longtime agent, Michael Sterling, hadn't returned her call since the afternoon. 3 major endorsement deals were reportedly under review by nervous corporate sponsors. Her publisher was making noises about delaying her upcoming memoir, citing concerns about legal liability. Even her closest Hollywood allies seemed to be maintaining a careful distance, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before deciding whether to support or abandon her. Whoopi stopped pacing and stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back seemed older than her 68 years, worn down by decades of fighting battles that had suddenly culminated in this moment of reckoning. She had weathered countless controversies throughout her career, from early stand-up routines that pushed boundaries to political statements that infuriated conservatives and liberals alike. But this felt different. This felt final. The irony wasn't lost on her that Pam Bondi, of all people, had become her potential destroyer. Their paths had crossed briefly years earlier at a charity gala in Miami, where they had exchanged pleasantries over cocktails and found themselves on opposite sides of a heated discussion about criminal justice reform. Even then, Whoopi had sensed something dangerous about the woman, an intelligence wrapped in Southern charm that masked a ruthlessness few people ever saw coming. Her assistant, Maria Santos, had left detailed notes about Bondi's background spread across the dining room table. The research painted a portrait of someone who never forgot a slight and rarely forgave an enemy. As Florida's Attorney General, she had built a reputation for taking on cases that others considered unwinnable, often emerging victorious through a combination of meticulous preparation and psychological warfare. Her confirmation as U.S. Attorney General had elevated her to a level of power that made her virtually untouchable. The legal analysis was even more sobering. Bondi's team had chosen their battleground carefully, filing in the Northern District of Florida, where she had cultivated relationships with judges and legal professionals throughout her career. The presiding judge, Harold Morrison, was a Reagan appointee known for his conservative leanings and skepticism toward media companies. The jury pool would be drawn from a region where the View's brand of progressive commentary was viewed with suspicion at best and outright hostility at worst. Whoopi's own legal team had painted an equally grim picture during their late-night strategy session. David Rothstein, her personal attorney for the past 15 years, had never sugarcoated difficult news, but even he seemed shaken by the scope of Bondi's assault. The amended complaint was a masterpiece of legal warfare, carefully constructed to exploit every weakness in a BC's position while maximizing potential damages. The defamation claims were bad enough, but the conspiracy allegations threatened to drag dozens of innocent people into a legal nightmare. Producers, writers, researchers, and even makeup artists could potentially be called as witnesses in depositions that would dissect every aspect of how the show operated. The discovery process alone would cost millions of dollars and expose years of internal communications to public scrutiny. What made the situation truly desperate was the speed at which everything was moving. Bondi's lawyers had filed motions demanding expedited discovery, claiming that ongoing broadcasts were causing irreparable harm to their client's reputation. They wanted depositions to begin within 60 days, giving the BC's legal team almost no time to mount an effective defense. The message was clear: settle now or face total destruction. Maria had also compiled a dossier on the key players in Bondi's legal army. The lead attorney, Jonathan Pierce, was a former federal prosecutor who had made his fortune dismantling corporate defendants in high-profile cases. His partner, Catherine Wells, specialized in media law and had extracted 9-figure settlements from 3 major news organizations in the past 5 years. Together, they formed a formidable team that had never lost a case of this magnitude. The clock struck 1 in the morning as Whoopi finally accepted what her advisors had been suggesting all day. Someone needed to reach out to Bondi directly, cutting through the lawyers and corporate intermediaries to find a human solution to what had become an existential crisis. The question was whether anyone could penetrate the fortress of attorneys and handlers that surrounded the Attorney General, and whether she would be willing to listen to a plea for mercy from someone she clearly viewed as an enemy. Rebecca Martinez had mentioned during the emergency meeting that her predecessor at a BC had maintained informal channels of communication with various political figures, back-channel relationships that could sometimes diffuse volatile situations before they exploded into public view. But those connections had withered over the years as the political climate became increasingly polarized and media companies grew more risk-averse. Whoopi's first instinct was to call Barbara Walters, her mentor and the creator of The View, but Barbara was in her 90s and dealing with her own health challenges. The last thing she needed was to be dragged into a crisis that could tarnish the legacy of the show she had built from nothing. Besides, Barbara's political connections were from a different era, when Republicans and Democrats could still find common ground behind closed doors. Her second thought was to reach out through mutual acquaintances in the entertainment industry, but most of those relationships were built on superficial networking rather than genuine trust. Hollywood parties and charity galas created the illusion of friendship, but when real crisis struck, those connections proved as fragile as tissue paper. She needed someone with authentic credibility who could vouch for her character and sincerity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria had discovered that Whoopi and Bondi shared a connection through Dr. Sarah Coleman, a child psychologist who had worked with both women on separate advocacy projects years earlier. Coleman had helped Whoopi establish her foundation for underprivileged youth, while also consulting with Bondi on juvenile justice reform initiatives when she was still Florida's Attorney General. Dr. Coleman lived in Coral Gables and maintained a low profile, avoiding the media circus that surrounded most people who worked with high-profile political figures. Her reputation for discretion and integrity had made her a trusted intermediary for sensitive negotiations involving children's welfare issues. If anyone could arrange a private conversation between two powerful women who viewed each other as Enemies, it would be someone like Coleman. The first challenge was tracking down Coleman's current contact information. Her public profile was deliberately minimal, with no social media presence and only a professional website that offered sparse details about her practice. Whoopi's research team had to dig through charity board listings and academic publications to find recent references that might lead to current phone numbers or email addresses. The call to Coleman came at 7:30 the next morning, after Whoopi had spent the remainder of the night drafting and redrafting the words she would use to explain her desperate situation. Coleman's voice was cautious but kind, clearly surprised to hear from someone she hadn't spoken with in nearly 5 years. The conversation was delicate, with Whoopi carefully explaining the legal crisis while avoiding details that might compromise attorney-client privilege. Coleman listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding of the stakes involved. She had followed the lawsuit in the news and was aware of its potential implications for both women's careers. Her response was measured but encouraging. She couldn't guarantee anything, but she was willing to reach out to Bondi's office and explore whether a private conversation might be possible. The waiting began immediately after Whoopi hung up the phone. Every minute felt like an hour as she imagined Coleman navigating the bureaucratic maze that surrounded any high-ranking government official. Phone calls to schedulers, messages passed through layers of staff, background checks on everyone involved in the potential meeting. The machinery of modern political security moved slowly, and time was a luxury Whoopi could no longer afford. Her phone finally rang at 3:15 that afternoon. Coleman's voice was neutral, professional, giving nothing away as she delivered the message that would determine Whoopi's fate. Bondi was willing to take a private call that evening, but only under strict conditions. No recording devices, no witnesses, no notes that could later be subpoenaed. The conversation would be entirely off the record, with no binding commitments from either party. The number Coleman provided was Bondi's direct line, a private cell phone that bypassed her official staff and security apparatus. The window for the call was narrow between 10 and 10:30 that evening, Eastern Time. If Whoopi missed that opportunity, there would be no second chance. Bondi was departing for a classified briefing following morning and would be unreachable for the remainder of the week. Whoopi spent the intervening hours preparing for the most important conversation of her life. She practiced different approaches, from humble contrition to passionate appeals for justice. She researched Bondi's personal background, looking for common ground that might create a connection beyond their political differences. She consulted with her therapist, Dr. Patricia Wong, about strategies for managing her own emotions during what would undoubtedly be a highly charged exchange. The one thing she couldn't prepare for was the uncertainty of how Bondi would respond. Would she be magnanimous in victory, willing to accept a sincere apology and reasonable compensation? Or would she be cold and calculating, viewing Whoopi's desperation as an opportunity to extract maximum punishment for perceived wrongs? Everything Whoopi had learned about Bondi suggested she was capable of both extremes, depending on her mood and strategic objectives. As 10 o'clock approached, Whoopi found herself alone in her study, staring at the phone number written in her own handwriting on a yellow legal pad. The weight of her empire, her show, her production company, her charitable foundation, her legacy rested on the next 30 minutes. One conversation would determine whether she emerged from this crisis as a survivor or watched everything she had built crumble into ruins. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the phone. Somewhere in Washington, Pam Bondi was waiting for a call that would either end a war or escalate it to total destruction. The most powerful woman in daytime television was about to discover whether America's chief law enforcement officer possessed the capacity for mercy. The phone rang once before a familiar voice answered, cold and professional, but unmistakably human. The conversation that followed would reshape both women's understanding of power, pride, and the price of public warfare. For Whoopi Goldberg, who had spent her entire career speaking truth to power, the moment had come to learn what it meant to be truly powerless. 2,000 miles away in her Georgetown townhouse, Pam Bondi sat in her private study surrounded by law books and legal briefs. The room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls lined with awards and commendations from her years in public service. A cup of herbal tea grew cold on the mahogany desk as she reviewed the final details of her case against a BC and The View. Unlike the frantic, energy-consuming Whoopi's Manhattan penthouse, Bondi's workspace radiated calm control. Every document was precisely organized, every legal strategy carefully mapped out with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most feared prosecutors in the country. She had been preparing for this conversation since Coleman's call that afternoon, anticipating every possible angle Whoopi might pursue in seeking mercy. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. For months, she had endured character assassination from a woman who commanded a platform reaching millions of viewers daily. The personal attacks had gone far beyond legitimate political criticism, crossing into territory that questioned her competence, her integrity, and even her basic humanity. Now that same woman was reduced to begging for forgiveness from someone she had tried to destroy. Bondi's legal team had advised against taking the call at all. From a purely strategic standpoint, there was no benefit to engaging with the opposition outside formal legal channels. Every word spoken could potentially be used against them later, and any sign of weakness might embolden a BC to mount a more aggressive defense. But Bondi had always trusted her instincts over conventional wisdom, and those instincts told her that this conversation could be more valuable than any courtroom victory. The files spread across her desk told a story of systematic targeting that went back nearly 2 years. Her research team had compiled video clips, transcripts, and social media posts that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated harassment disguised as legitimate commentary. The evidence would be devastating in court, but Bondi knew that some victories were more satisfying when achieved through private humiliation rather than public spectacle. At exactly 10 o'clock, her private phone rang. She let it ring 3 times before answering, a small power play that would set the tone for everything that followed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who held all the cards and knew it. The voice on the other end was unmistakably Whoopi's, but stripped of its usual confidence and bravado. Gone was the sharp wit that had made her famous, replaced by something Bondi had rarely heard from her enemies: genuine fear. The conversation that followed would test both women's understanding of power, pride, and the price of waging war, inclusive waging war in Koso. The public arena. Whoopi's opening words were carefully chosen, acknowledging the gravity of the situation while attempting to establish a human connection beyond their legal dispute. She spoke about their shared commitment to charitable causes, their mutual respect for Barbara Walters, and their common ground on issues affecting children and families. It was a diplomatic approach designed to remind Bondi that they were both complex human beings rather than caricatures created by political warfare. But Bondi wasn't interested in pleasantries or false reconciliation. Her response was measured but cold, cutting through Whoopi's attempts at charm with surgical precision. She had been personally targeted by The View's attacks, she explained, and the damage to her reputation extended far beyond professional consequences. Friends had questioned her judgment, family members had faced harassment, and her ability to effectively serve as Attorney General had been compromised by the constant barrage of false narratives. The conversation shifted as Whoopi realized that her usual tactics weren't working. The woman on the other end of the line couldn't be charmed or manipulated through celebrity charisma. Bondi demanded specificity, forcing Whoopi to acknowledge particular segments and statements that had crossed the line from legitimate criticism into defamatory territory. What followed was a detailed examination of the most damaging content, with Bondi walking through each allegation and its impact on her personal and professional life. She described meetings with foreign officials who had questioned her credibility based on things they had seen on The View. She talked about family gatherings where relatives felt compelled to defend her against attacks they had watched on television. She painted a picture of a woman whose entire life had been disrupted by what Whoopi had dismissed as harmless entertainment. The psychological pressure was expertly applied. Bondi wasn't just seeking financial compensation. She wanted acknowledgement of the human cost of Whoopi's words. Every example was carefully chosen to maximize emotional impact while building a legal case that would be virtually impossible to defend against in court. The message was clear. This wasn't just about money or professional rivalry, but about basic human decency and accountability. Whoopi found herself in the unfamiliar position of being intellectually outmatched. The woman she had dismissed as a political hack was proving to be a formidable opponent who understood both legal strategy and psychological warfare. Every attempt to deflect or minimize the situation was met with specific examples and documented evidence that made denial impossible. The conversation took on an almost therapeutic quality as Bondi demanded that Whoopi confront the real world consequences of her public statements. This wasn't about political differences or ideological disagreements, but about the weaponization of celebrity platforms to destroy individual reputations. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear from behind The View's desk was revealed to be far more complex when examined through the lens of personal responsibility. As the minutes ticked by, Whoopi realized that her usual strategies were not only ineffective but potentially counterproductive. Bondi had prepared for this conversation with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her a successful prosecutor. Every emotional appeal was countered with legal facts. Every attempt at humor was met with cold professionalism. The discussion eventually turned to potential resolution, but Bondi's terms were harsher than anything ABC's lawyers had anticipated. She wanted more than money. She demanded public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, changes to The View's editorial processes, and personal guarantees from individual hosts about future conduct. The conversation revealed that she had studied her opponent's weaknesses and designed her demands to inflict maximum humiliation while remaining legally defensible. What emerged from the lengthy exchange was a clear understanding of the stakes involved. This wasn't just a lawsuit about defamation. It was a broader conflict about accountability in the media age. Bondi positioned herself as a victim seeking justice against a system that allowed powerful celebrities to destroy reputations without consequences. The narrative she constructed was compelling and would play well to any jury that might eventually hear the case. The call ended without resolution, but both women understood that the real negotiation had only just begun. Whoopi had learned that her opponent was far more dangerous than she had imagined, while Bondi had confirmed that The View's hosts were vulnerable to sustained legal pressure. The private conversation had accomplished more than months of formal legal proceedings, establishing a direct channel of communication that would determine whether the conflict could be resolved or would escalate into total warfare. In the silence that followed the ended call, both women contemplated the price of pride and the cost of public battle. For Whoopi, the conversation had been a humbling reminder that celebrity status provided no protection against determined adversaries who understood how to exploit the legal system. For Bondi, it had been confirmation that her strategy was working and that total victory was within reach. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would reshape the landscape of media accountability and determine whether America's most famous talk show host could survive the most serious challenge of her career. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the woman who had been underestimated for far too long. The sleepless nights following that devastating phone Conversation blurred together in a haze of desperate strategizing and mounting. Panic. Whoopi's Manhattan penthouse, once a sanctuary of success and achievement, had transformed into a war room where her career's final battle would be fought. Legal documents covered every surface, while her phones buzzed endlessly with updates. From lawyers, agents, and executives, all scrambling to contain a crisis that grew more devastating by the hour. Rebecca Martinez arrived at dawn on Thursday with news that sent shockwaves through ABC's executive ranks. 3 more major advertisers had pulled their contracts overnight, citing concerns about brand association with ongoing litigation. Walmart, Target, and surprisingly even Ben & Jerry's had suspended their sponsorship deals pending resolution of the lawsuit. The financial hemorrhaging had accelerated beyond anyone's worst-case projections, with The View losing nearly 40% of its advertising revenue in less than 2 weeks. The network's insurance company had also delivered a crushing blow, informing ABC that several key provisions in their media liability policy might not apply to this case. Bondi's lawyers had cleverly structured their allegations to exploit gaps in coverage, particularly around claims of intentional misconduct and conspiracy. The insurer's preliminary assessment suggested that ABC could be personally liable for as much as $600 million if they lost in court, an amount that would bankrupt the show and potentially damage the entire network. Thomas Blackwell convened an emergency board meeting that Thursday afternoon, where Disney's top executives participated via secure video conference from Burbank. The conversation was tense and clinical, with corporate lawyers dissecting every aspect of ABC's exposure while accountants calculated the potential impact on Disney's quarterly earnings. The entertainment giant had weathered numerous controversies over its long history, but this situation threatened to create a precedent that could affect every media property in their vast portfolio. What made the crisis particularly dangerous was its timing. Disney was in the middle of delicate negotiations for several major content deals, including international streaming rights worth billions of dollars. Foreign partners were already expressing concerns about associating with a company facing such serious legal challenges. The Bondi lawsuit had metastasized beyond a simple defamation case into a corporate reputation crisis that threatened deals across multiple business units. Whoopi found herself increasingly isolated as the scandal consumed everything around her. Her longtime co-hosts began distancing themselves from the controversy, with Joy Beher's representatives making it clear that she would not participate in any joint defense strategy. Sunny Hostin had retained her own legal counsel and was reportedly preparing to testify against the show if necessary to protect her own career. The unity that had made The View successful was crumbling under legal pressure and self-preservation instincts. Her personal business empire was collapsing with equal speed. The publisher of her upcoming memoir had formally canceled the contract, citing force majeure clauses related to legal entanglements. 3 major film projects that had been in development were suddenly placed on indefinite hold as studios calculated the reputational risks of working with someone facing such serious litigation. Even her cannabis business partnership was being reviewed by nervous investors who feared association with the controversy. The public relations nightmare intensified when Bondi made her first public statement about the lawsuit during a carefully orchestrated press conference in Washington. Standing before a backdrop of American flags with her legal team flanking her on both sides, she delivered a devastating 15-minute statement that reframed the entire controversy in terms of media accountability and justice for public servants. Bondi's words were measured and precise, each sentence crafted to maximize sympathy while minimizing legal risk. She spoke about the personal toll of constant character assassination, describing how the attacks had affected her family relationships and professional effectiveness. She positioned herself as a reluctant plaintiff who had been forced into litigation only after exhausting every other option for addressing the systematic campaign against her reputation. The press conference was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to shift public opinion decisively in Bondi's favor. She took no questions from reporters, leaving the media to speculate about her motivations while her carefully prepared statement dominated news cycles across the country. Conservative outlets praised her courage in standing up to liberal media bias, while even some traditionally progressive voices acknowledged that she appeared to have legitimate grievances. The impact on public opinion was immediate and devastating for Whoopi. Social media sentiment, which had been roughly divided along political lines, shifted dramatically toward Bondi after the press conference. Even many of the view's longtime supporters began questioning whether the show had crossed ethical lines in its coverage of political figures. The hashtag #JusticeForPam began trending alongside continued demands for accountability from media companies. Behind the scenes, the BC's legal team was fracturing under the pressure of mounting evidence and impossible deadlines. David Rothstein, Whoopi's personal attorney, had begun exploring plea bargain options that would minimize his client's personal liability, even if it meant sacrificing the show. Other lawyers were pushing for a more aggressive strategy that would challenge Bondi's standing to sue and question the validity of her damage claims. The discovery process revealed the extent of Bondi's preparation for this legal war. Her team had compiled thousands of hours of video content, social media posts, and internal communications that painted a damning picture of coordinated targeting. They had interviewed former employees who described editorial meetings where Bondi was specifically discussed as a target for negative coverage. Most damaging of all, they had obtained emails between producers that contained joking references to destroying her credibility. One particularly devastating piece of evidence emerged from a private WhatsApp group used by the View's writing staff. Messages dating back 18 months showed writers sharing negative stories about Bondi and brainstorming ways to incorporate attacks into upcoming segments. While the content might have been protected under normal editorial privilege, Bondi's lawyers argued that it demonstrated malicious intent that voided those protections. The psychological pressure on Whoopi intensified as depositions began for other BC employees. Producers, writers, and researchers were forced to testify under oath about their roles in creating content that targeted Bondi. Many of these witnesses had never anticipated being dragged into a major lawsuit and were unprepared for the aggressive questioning from Bondi's legal team. Their testimony often contradicted BC's public statements about editorial independence and journalistic integrity. Maria Santos, Whoopi's loyal assistant, delivered perhaps the most crushing news during a private meeting in Whoopi's dressing room after a particularly difficult taping session. Industry contacts were reporting that several major television networks were actively recruiting talent from The View, anticipating that the show's cancellation was inevitable. Agents were quietly reaching out to producers and technical staff, offering them exit strategies before the ship completely sank. The ratings decline was equally catastrophic, with viewership dropping to levels not seen since the show's earliest seasons. Focus groups revealed that even loyal fans were growing uncomfortable with the legal controversy and the negative publicity surrounding their favorite hosts. The show that had once defined daytime television was becoming toxic to its own audience, trapped in a downward spiral that seemed impossible to reverse. International markets were abandoning The View as well, with distribution deals being cancelled. In Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, foreign broadcasters cited concerns about legal liability and audience backlash as reasons for terminating agreements that had been profitable for decades. The global brand that BC had spent years building was evaporating as quickly as domestic support. Whoopi's health began deteriorating under the relentless pressure, with her doctor prescribing anxiety medication and recommending a leave of absence that she couldn't afford to take. Sleep deprivation and stress were affecting her performance. On air, leading to on-camera mistakes and awkward moments that became fodder for critics and internet memes. The vibrant personality that had made her a star was being replaced by a hollow shell, struggling to maintain basic composure. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal deposition, where Bondi's lawyers forced Whoopi to watch hours of her own commentary about their client. Sitting in a sterile conference room surrounded by hostile attorneys, she was confronted with the cumulative impact of months of negative coverage. The experience was designed to be humiliating, and it achieved its intended effect with devastating precision. Each clip was worse than she remembered, with context removed and inflammatory moments highlighted for maximum impact. Jokes that had seemed harmless in the moment appeared cruel and calculated when strung together in a prosecutorial narrative. Comments that were meant to be political criticism looked like personal attacks designed to destroy someone's character and livelihood. The deposition lasted 14 hours over 2 days, with Bondi's lawyers systematically dismantling every defense that Whoopi and her team had prepared. They forced her to acknowledge that she had never attempted to contact Bondi for comment before making accusations. They made her admit that she had relied on secondary sources without independent verification. Most damaging of all, they got her to concede that she had allowed personal political feelings to influence her coverage of a public official. Thomas Blackwell made the decision that would seal The View's fate during an emergency conference call with Disney executives on a Friday evening in November. The potential liability had become too great to justify continued support for the show, and the reputational damage was spreading beyond ABC to affect Disney's other properties. The View would be canceled at the end of its current season, with the network accepting whatever settlement terms Bondi's team demanded. The announcement was delayed until the following Monday to allow for proper legal coordination, but word leaked over the weekend through industry insiders who had been preparing for this outcome. Entertainment reporters confirmed the cancellation through multiple sources, with headlines proclaiming the end of an era in daytime television. The show that had survived host departures, political controversies, and even a global pandemic had finally met an opponent it couldn't overcome. Whoopi learned about the cancellation through a phone call from Rebecca Martinez at 6 in the morning, moments before the news broke publicly. The conversation was brief and professional, with legal counsel advising her to avoid any public statements that might complicate ongoing settlement negotiations. Her empire had crumbled overnight, leaving her to contemplate a future that looked radically different from anything she had imagined. The settlement negotiations moved swiftly once ABC capitulated to Bondi's demands. The final agreement included a payment of $350 million, split between network insurance and personal contributions from individual hosts. Whoopi's share alone would consume the majority of her liquid assets, forcing her to sell properties and liquidate investments that had taken decades to accumulate. More humiliating than the financial penalty were the non-monetary terms that Bondi had insisted upon. ABC was required to issue a formal apology acknowledging that coverage of Bondi had been unfair and inaccurate. The network agreed to implement new editorial guidelines specifically designed to prevent future targeting of public officials. Most degrading of all, Whoopi was forced to record a personal video apology that would be posted on The View's official social media accounts. The recording session for the apology video was perhaps the most difficult moment of Whoopi's entire career. Sitting alone in a studio that had once been her domain, she struggled to deliver words that had been crafted by lawyers and approved by Bondi's representatives. The script required her to acknowledge specific mistakes and express genuine remorse for the harm her words had caused. Take after take was rejected by Bondi's team, who demanded a level of sincerity and humiliation that pushed Whoopi to her emotional breaking point. The woman who had built her career on fearless authenticity was forced to perform contrition for someone she still viewed as a political enemy. The final version that was eventually approved captured a broken Woman accepting responsibility for the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The apology video went viral within hours of its release, generating millions of views and countless reactions across social media platforms. Conservative commentators celebrated Bondi's victory as a triumph of accountability over media arrogance, while progressive voices mourned the loss of one of their most prominent champions. The video became a symbol of changing power dynamics in American media, marking a new era where public figures could successfully fight back against negative coverage. Pam Bondi's public response to the settlement was magnanimous in victory, striking a tone of reconciliation rather than revenge. During a press conference announcing the resolution, she spoke about the importance of civil discourse and the need for media organizations to maintain basic standards of fairness. Her measured response enhanced her reputation as a thoughtful leader while positioning her as someone who had reluctantly but successfully defended herself against unjust attacks. The broader implications of Bondi's victory reverberated throughout the media industry, with news organizations rushing to review their own editorial policies and legal protections. Several other public figures announced plans to pursue similar lawsuits against media companies, emboldened by the precedent that had been established. The cost of aggressive political commentary suddenly included the risk of devastating financial liability. Whoopi's final taping of The View was an emotional affair attended by longtime fans, industry colleagues, and even some former adversaries who recognized the end of an era. Her closing monologue was unscripted and deeply personal, reflecting on a career that had spanned multiple entertainment mediums and generated both passionate love and intense hatred from audiences across the political spectrum. She spoke about the lessons learned from her downfall, acknowledging that celebrity, status, and good intentions were not sufficient protection against the consequences of careless words. The woman who had never backed down from any fight admitted that she had underestimated an opponent who proved more formidable than anyone in Hollywood had anticipated. Her final words were a warning to others about the changing landscape of media accountability and the need for greater responsibility in public discourse. The studio audience's standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes, with many viewers openly weeping as they witnessed the end of a cultural institution. The View had been more than just a television show. It had been a daily gathering place for women who wanted to see their own voices reflected in mainstream media. Its cancellation represented not just the end of one program, but the silencing of a perspective that had shaped American conversations for over 2 decades. In the months that followed, Whoopi retreated from public life to rebuild both her finances and her reputation. The woman who had once commanded millions of viewers now found herself planning a much quieter future, with speaking engagements at small venues and writing projects that would never reach the massive audience she had once taken for granted. The empire that had taken decades to build had been destroyed in a matter of months by an opponent who understood the power of patience and precision. Pam Bondi's victory established her as one of the most effective political fighters of her generation, someone who had successfully weaponized the legal system against media adversaries while maintaining the moral high ground. Her reputation as Attorney General was enhanced rather than damaged by the controversy, proving that sometimes the best defense against character assassination is a devastating counterattack that leaves opponents too damaged to continue their assault. The View's cancellation marked the end of an era in American television, but it also signaled the beginning of a new chapter in media accountability. The show's demise served as a warning to other programs that the old rules of engagement had changed, and that public figures now possessed tools for fighting back that could destroy even the most established entertainment properties. Years later, media scholars would study the Bondi-Goldberg conflict as a pivotal moment in the evolution of American political discourse. The case demonstrated how traditional power structures could be disrupted by determined individuals who understood both legal strategy and public relations warfare. It proved that celebrity status and institutional support were insufficient protection against adversaries who possessed superior preparation and unwavering determination. The legacy of the lawsuit extended far beyond the immediate participants, reshaping how news organizations approached political coverage and forcing entertainment companies to reconsider the risks associated with aggressive commentary. The precedent established by Bondi's victory would influence media behavior for decades to come, creating a new standard of accountability that fundamentally altered the relationship between public figures and the press. For Whoopi Goldberg, the experience served as a harsh reminder that words have consequences and that even the most successful careers can be destroyed by underestimating the wrong opponent. Her fall from grace became a cautionary tale about the dangers of wielding media power without considering the potential for devastating retaliation from those with the resources and determination to fight back. The story of how America's most famous talk show host was brought down by a single determined adversary would be remembered as one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in entertainment history. It proved that in the modern media landscape, no one is too powerful to fall, and that sometimes the most unlikely opponents can deliver the most devastating defeats. The mahogany boardroom at Disney headquarters in Burbank had never witnessed a postmortem quite like this one. 6 months after the View's cancellation, executives from across the entertainment conglomerate gathered to dissect what had become known internally as the Bondi incident, a case study in how a single lawsuit could devastate a profitable media property and send shockwaves throughout an entire industry. Sarah Mitchell, Disney's chief risk officer, stood before a room of senior executives with a presentation that would reshape how the company approached political content across all its platforms. The slides on the massive screen behind her told a story of cascading financial losses that extended far beyond a BC's daytime programming slot. The View's cancellation had triggered a domino effect that touched everything from streaming content guidelines to international distribution agreements. The financial autopsy revealed staggering numbers that had taken months to fully calculate. Beyond the $350 million settlement, Disney had absorbed an additional $200 million in lost advertising revenue, canceled distribution deals, and emergency legal fees. The company's stock price had dropped 12% during the height of the controversy, wiping out nearly $15 billion in market capitalization before gradually recovering. More troubling than the immediate financial impact was the precedent that Bondi's victory had established across the entertainment industry. Within 3 months of the View's cancellation, 17 major media companies had implemented new content review processes specifically designed to avoid similar legal exposure. The chilling effect on political commentary was exactly what Bondi's legal team had hoped to achieve when they crafted their initial strategy. Michael Torres, Disney's general counsel, outlined the new legal landscape that media companies now had to navigate. Public figures were increasingly willing to pursue aggressive litigation against news organizations, emboldened by Bondi's success and supported by well-funded legal advocacy groups. The traditional protections that had shielded media companies from defamation claims were being systematically challenged by attorneys who had studied Bondi's playbook. The presentation included case studies of ongoing lawsuits that directly referenced the Bondi precedent. A former governor was suing CNN for $200 million, citing similar allegations of systematic character assassination. A Supreme Court justice had filed a $100 million claim against MSNBC, arguing that their coverage had damaged his ability to perform his constitutional duties. The legal strategies in both cases borrowed heavily from the tactics that had destroyed The View. What made these copycat lawsuits particularly dangerous was their sophisticated understanding of media vulnerabilities. Bondi's legal team had essentially provided a roadmap for attacking news organizations, identifying weak points in editorial processes and insurance coverage that could be exploited by determined plaintiffs. The result was an arms race between media companies seeking to protect themselves and public figures looking to weaponize the legal system. Jennifer Walsh, ABC's new president of daytime programming, described the network's struggle to rebuild its afternoon lineup after The View's cancellation. The show had been the cornerstone of ABC's daytime strategy for over 2 decades, generating reliable ratings and advertising revenue that subsidized less profitable programming. Replacing that revenue stream had proven nearly impossible, forcing the network to fundamentally rethink its approach to daytime television. The new programming strategy deliberately avoided political content, focusing instead on lifestyle shows, celebrity interviews, and entertainment news that posed minimal legal risk. The shift represented a dramatic retreat from the bold commentary that had made The View culturally relevant, but executives viewed it as necessary protection against future legal challenges. The era of fearless political discourse on daytime television had effectively ended with Whoopi's forced apology. International ramifications extended far beyond American media companies. Foreign broadcasters that had licensed content from Disney were demanding protection clauses in their agreements, seeking guarantees that they wouldn't be exposed to legal liability from controversial programming. The global marketplace for American entertainment content had become significantly more restrictive as international partners calculated the risks of association with politically charged material. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a media law professor at Columbia University who had been retained as a consultant, explained how the Bondi case had fundamentally altered the relationship between public figures and news organizations. The traditional balance between press freedom and personal reputation had shifted decisively in favor of public officials who possessed the resources and determination to mount sustained legal challenges. The academic analysis revealed that Bondi's victory had been years in the making, building on a foundation of conservative legal scholarship that challenged the broad protections traditionally afforded to media companies. The Supreme Court's composition had gradually become more receptive to arguments that press freedom should be balanced against other constitutional principles, creating an environment where aggressive defamation claims could succeed. Technology. Companies were also grappling with the implications of the new legal environment. Social media platforms that had previously taken a hands-off approach to political content were implementing stricter moderation policies to avoid potential liability. The algorithms that determined which content users saw were being adjusted to reduce the visibility of posts that could be construed as defamatory, effectively creating a new form of censorship driven by legal rather than editorial considerations. The human cost of the controversy extended far beyond Whoopi's personal downfall. Dozens of View employees had lost their jobs when the show was canceled, many of them behind-the-scenes workers who had never been involved in political content. Decisions. Production assistants, camera operators, makeup artists, and researchers suddenly found themselves unemployed because of a legal battle they had no control over. Maria Santos, Whoopi's former assistant, had struggled to find new employment in an industry that viewed anyone associated with The View as potentially toxic. Her 20-year career in television production had been effectively ended by her association with a controversy she had tried to discourage from the beginning. The collateral damage from Bondi's legal assault had spread far beyond its intended targets. The psychological impact on other television hosts was equally significant. Joy Behar had retired from public life entirely, citing the stress of the legal proceedings and her desire to avoid future controversies. Sunny Hostin had scaled back her television appearances and returned to practicing law, viewing media work as too risky given the new legal environment. The exodus of experienced hosts from political programming represented a brain drain that would take years to reverse. Conservative media outlets celebrated these developments as long overdue, Accountability for liberal bias in mainstream entertainment. They portrayed Bondi as a hero who had successfully challenged the media establishment and forced news organizations to consider the real-world impact of their coverage decisions. The narrative of David versus Goliath resonated with audiences who felt that traditional media had become disconnected from their values and concerns. Progressive voices expressed alarm at what they viewed as a systematic assault on press freedom, disguised as individual justice. They argued that Bondi's victory would embolden authoritarian politicians to use the legal system as a weapon against critical coverage, ultimately undermining the media's role as a check on government power. The debate over whether the case represented justice or censorship continued to divide public opinion along political lines. Legal scholars were split on the broader implications of the precedent that had been established. Some argued that media companies had operated with impunity for too long, using their platforms to destroy reputations without adequate accountability mechanisms. Others warned that the new legal environment would lead to self-censorship that would undermine investigative journalism and political commentary. The insurance industry responded to the changing risk environment by dramatically increasing premiums for media liability coverage while simultaneously reducing the scope of protection offered. Companies that had previously enjoyed broad coverage for defamation claims now faced policies with extensive exclusions and much higher deductibles. The cost of producing political content had effectively doubled overnight as organizations scrambled to protect themselves from potential lawsuits. Corporate advertisers were also reassessing their relationships with news and entertainment programming. Major brands that had traditionally supported controversial content as a way to demonstrate their values were pulling back from anything that might expose them to public backlash or legal challenges. The advertising dollars that had funded aggressive political commentary were migrating to safer programming that posed fewer reputational risks. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi had emerged from the controversy with her reputation not just intact but significantly enhanced. Her handling of the legal battle was studied in law schools as a masterclass in strategic litigation, demonstrating how careful preparation and psychological warfare could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. She had transformed from a regional political figure into a national symbol of successful resistance against media bias. The Attorney General's office had used the victory to expand its influence over media policy at the federal level. Bondi's team was working with other government agencies to develop new guidelines for how news organizations covered public officials, creating regulatory frameworks that would institutionalize the principles established in her lawsuit. The legal victory was being leveraged into broader policy changes that would affect the entire media landscape. Whoopi's attempt at a comeback had been largely unsuccessful, with her post-View projects failing to capture either critical acclaim or commercial success. A planned autobiography was canceled by its publisher after advance sales failed to meet expectations. Speaking engagements that had once commanded six-figure fees were now limited to small venues and modest honorariums. The woman who had once been one of the most recognizable voices in American entertainment had been effectively marginalized. Her financial situation remained precarious despite efforts to rebuild her wealth through smaller projects and personal appearances. The settlement had consumed the majority of her liquid assets, forcing her to sell properties and liquidate investments that had been intended to fund her retirement. At an age when most celebrities were enjoying the fruits of their lifetime achievements, she found herself starting over with limited prospects for recovery. The psychological toll of the defeat was evident in her rare public appearances, where the spark and energy that had made her famous were noticeably dimmed. Friends described someone who had been fundamentally changed by the experience of powerlessness, struggling to reconcile her identity as a fearless truth-teller with the reality of having been so thoroughly defeated by someone she had underestimated. Industry insiders speculated about whether Whoopi would ever fully recover from the professional and personal devastation of the lawsuit. Some viewed her downfall as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked celebrity power, while others saw it as a tragic example of how the legal system could be weaponized to silence dissenting voices. The debate reflected broader cultural divisions about accountability, power, and the role of media in democratic society. The transformation of American political discourse in the wake of The View's cancellation was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Bondi's victory. Television producers, podcast hosts, and social media influencers all modified their approach to covering public figures, knowing that aggressive criticism could now result in devastating legal consequences. The marketplace of ideas had been fundamentally altered by the introduction of financial liability as a factor in editorial decision-making. Academic institutions began incorporating the Bondi case into their curricula, using it as an example of how legal strategy could reshape media behavior more effectively than government regulation or public pressure. Law schools analyzed the litigation tactics, while journalism schools examined the ethical implications of the new constraints on political coverage. The case became a touchstone for discussions about the balance between free speech and personal accountability. The international media community watched these developments with growing concern, recognizing that the American precedent could influence legal frameworks in other democratic societies. European broadcasters reported increasing pressure from politicians who cited Bondi's victory as justification for their own legal challenges against critical coverage. The global implications of a single lawsuit in Florida were becoming apparent as authoritarian leaders worldwide studied the tactics that had proven so effective. Technology platforms were forced to reconsider their content moderation policies. In light of the new legal environment, algorithms that had previously amplified controversial political content were being adjusted to reduce the risk of hosting material that could trigger expensive lawsuits. The digital ecosystem that had democratized political commentary was being reshaped by legal considerations that favored caution over boldness. The long-term cultural impact of Whoopi's downfall extended beyond media and politics into broader questions about celebrity, accountability, and power in American society. Her fall from grace served as a reminder that no individual, regardless of their fame or influence, was immune from the consequences of their actions when confronted by a determined adversary with superior resources and strategy. As the entertainment industry continued to grapple with the implications of the Bondi precedent, one thing had become clear: the rules of engagement between public figures and media organizations had been permanently altered. The age of consequence-free political commentary was over, replaced by a new era where every word carried the potential for devastating legal and financial repercussions. The story of how America's most famous talk show host was systematically destroyed by a single determined opponent would be remembered as a watershed moment in the evolution of American media. It demonstrated that in the modern legal landscape, traditional power structures could be disrupted by individuals who understood how to weaponize the system against their adversaries. For Pam Bondi, the victory represented more than personal vindication. It established a new template for how public figures could fight back against media attacks. Her success inspired a generation of politicians and public officials to view aggressive litigation not as a last resort, but as a primary tool for managing their public image and silencing critics. The legacy of the lawsuit would continue to shape American political discourse for decades to come, serving as both a warning to media organizations and an inspiration to public figures who felt they had been unfairly targeted. The balance of power between press and politics had shifted decisively, creating a new equilibrium that would define the relationship between media and government for years to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.